Welcome to the RMP interview series, where we interview authors of the Rusty Rust Belt Face Micropress. Today, we're going to be interviewing Lorene Bowles, who published A Tree Called We. Lorene is a lifelong creative with a passion for the written word. A native of the greater Cleveland metro area, Lorene's roots in Parma, Old Brooklyn, and the surrounding suburbs run deep. In that time, she has amassed a mighty poetry collection while enjoying her life with her husband, Richard. A Tree Called We is her first poetry chapbook. And Lorene, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Could we please start off with a poem?
Yes. Behind the yellow snapdragons, we put 6 slices of white bread behind the yellow snapdragons for the birds. None had come. Later, a large colony of small ants were marching in tight, precise formation, each with one tiny bite of bread, going home to the hole under the tree. In an almost parallel path, more marched, hole to path, to geraniums, to path, to rock, to path, to yellow snapdragons, to bread, never resting or out of step, in a procession that continued for hours until every crumb was gone and every ant was home. Perhaps they ate all the bread at once. They might have made some bread pudding. Maybe they stored some in the pantry with other items that could be eaten later if guests should stop in to visit, or in case it would be storming the next day. Did they share with frail or elderly relatives?
I love this collection, and one of the things I think people should know about this collection is that you and Richard both wrote poems for it. I mean, the poems are predominantly yours, but Richard, your husband, contributed. And a lot of your writing reflects the camaraderie that the two of you share. What can you say about this collection that you would like people to know? And where did these poems come from?
Well, first of all, I'm very happy with it. And Jeremy did the choosing of what poems would be in here. I gave him everything I had ever written and said, you go through them and choose what you think belongs in there. So I'm happy that he chose what he did. And most of the poems just came out of my experience with just being places where something just struck my fancy and I thought, oh, I have to write something about that. And I kept a notebook for years called Tatters. I named the book, it was just a notebook, and it stood for think about these that each requires service. And I would write whatever came to my mind. So I have poems in there and just thoughts on places that I was and so forth. But a lot of my poems came from there. And other poems just came to me as I was at a meeting and somebody said something that struck my fancy. Some of my poems came from Jeremy, who occasionally at our workshop would give us a prompt and I would run with it and write something that I thought went with it. He usually liked them. and a lot of them have to do with just things that happened in my life. I have one about my son and so forth. There are just a big variety of things.
Yeah, you write about everything. And do you think that's a reflex? Do you think just you turn to writing to process, or is it a relaxation method, or how do you approach writing?
Well, both of those things are true. I know I always liked to write from the time I was in the 4th grade. That was when I wrote my first poem. And the teacher was reading poems to us. And I just said, gee, I'm going to do that. And so I went home and I did that with the first thing I thought of, and which was a key. And so it just took off from there. I would be at school and the English teacher would talk about something that we were reading in literature, and a sentence in the literature would strike me. So I would go home and make that into a poem. and just all sorts of things. I used to like folk music years and years ago, and I would go to a coffee house and hear something that inspired me, and I would write about that. Sometimes it was about something sad, and I would have to write about that. I have a number of things about trees, because whenever I wanted to be by myself and get away from people, not that I didn't like the people, but just I wanted to just be by myself and think, there I would find a tree and I would either climb it when I was younger, or I would go and sit under it and I would write.
Mm.
And that still happens. I don't climb it anymore since I'm 80.
Why poetry? I mean, like out of all the different, because you've done other types of writing. You wrote a children's book. You wrote you worked for the Old Brooklyn Historical Society, and you did stories and documentation for them. You were a teacher for a number of years. I mean, what about poetry always drew you in?
Well, I guess poetry spoke to my heart is the only way I can say it. I did write short stories, and I wrote one book for my son to read to him when he was little, and with the Historical Society, my husband and I interviewed 77 older people for 2 booklets that were published on oral histories. And so I really enjoyed doing that. And I've always enjoyed meeting somebody and finding out what they were about just by asking them questions. And sometimes that would just spark a poem in me. And so then I wrote it. One of the poems in here is from my friend who told me that her daughter's birthday was coming and she didn't know what to get her for her birthday. And I said, well, tell me about her. So she did. And one of the poems in here is the one I gave to her. So a lot of things sparked my interest in poetry. Although I love to read, we both are members of the Chautauqua Institution Literary Circle, and we had to read 110 books from their reading list, and they were on all sorts of things. They were poetry and science and anything else you can imagine. So a lot of things sparked my interest in poetry.
Yeah. You've been a part of like local workshops, and you've been a part of the Parma and Brooklyn communities forever. And how do you feel about the writing communities here? How do you feel about the artists who work here and the people you've encountered?
Truthfully, I don't recall before I joined the workshop in Parma here 7 years ago, I think it was. I don't recall ever having another workshop that I heard about that was in Parma, or I would have gone, but I didn't know that there was one. And when I saw this in the paper, I was just really happy and really excited. And I said, I'm going to that no matter what, I'm going. And so we went. And of course, my husband just came along for the ride, but now he's writing poetry, thanks to everybody in the group. But I think that Parma could do, not just Parma, a lot of the cities could do a lot more with poetry, because you talk to people and they have something in their heart they want to say, and they've never said it on paper. And I think it would be a great thing if we had more people doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things I've always wondered is, and I don't have an answer for it, and even with the local workshop and everything, and everybody's different, so I'm sure there's no one answer. But I've never been able to figure out why poetry doesn't come as easily as stories. And I think maybe it's like like this sort of offbeat approach to how the expression works, how it's not like a story. I think is easier to follow. And sometimes I think people look at a poem and maybe think, oh, well, it's they don't understand why they're reading a poem about just a single feeling or just a single moment in a day. But you, having gone and been with the workshop for a long time, and seeing new people come and older members go, what do you think that could be? Do you think that do you think that there's a way that you could reach people, or that would be a good way to reach out to people and get them interested?
Well, I think that it seems to me when you talk to people who say, I don't like poetry, when you tell them that you've written a poem and they say, oh, I don't like poetry, and then you say, why? And they said, well, they would say, not just one person said, they listened to poems when they were little and they were nursery rhymes, but from there, they basically skipped to stories until in high school, an English teacher would have them read some kind of a long poem that was pages and pages long, and it didn't keep their interest. So then they just decided they didn't like poetry, so they let it go. But they didn't dig deeper and find the things that were in their heart that they wanted to say, and they could say in a shorter amount of words than pages and pages. And I think if we could have a way to introduce people to that thought process and that give them prompts, I think if we gave them prompts, that's one of the things that had me writing more poetry when in the workshop and other places, and I started looking them up online, there were prompts and they write about this. And even now, sometimes I want to write a poem and I can't think of what to write about. And I will just say to whoever I happen to be with, tell me something to write about. And whatever they write about is what I write about. And I enjoy doing that. And maybe we could do that with more people.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I think poetry is intimidating too, or it can be. I think there's some writers are really interested in making it a game between themselves and the reader in various ways, and other people like to be more straightforward. Maybe, I don't know. I'm just spitballing. This isn't even a prompt for a question. I just like hearing your thoughts about this.
I think that some people are intimidated because they'll come to the workshop, and the workshop is a wonderful place to go. But you have people who are just brand new, who had nothing to do that night and heard it was at the library. Or there are other people who have been writing poems for years and years and years. And when the new person hears them, they think, oh, I could never do that sometimes. And people have to encourage them. It doesn't matter if you're new and you're expressing what you have inside you, express it. Next time you might be able to express it a little different way, or you might come up with another idea just by hearing other people give their ideas. So give it a try.
I think that's true. I think that's why Richard started writing, is just that over time he realized that there's a lot of value in what he saw happening around him every month.
Yeah, Richard came and he would, at first he just sat in the back and he said, oh, good, we're going home. Because he didn't have any interest in it, or he just was taking me. But he came regularly, and after a while he started saying, I really enjoyed that so and so read, and that's really true, and I thought about that. And then he'd say someplace else that we went, gee, that could be made into a nice poem or whatever. He said a lot of different things. And pretty soon he started writing poetry. It happened when he became ill one year and he had to just rest a lot. And we have a screened in front porch. So it was nice out, and he would sit in his rocking chair on the screened in front porch every day. And that's where he really, really started writing poetry, because he had time on his hands and all kinds of things were going on in his mind and in the books that he was reading for Chautauqua, and people going down the street, and he just started writing. I was so thrilled when he came in and said, would you check this out and read it? I said, okay. And he had written it. I was just so thrilled. And I think a lot of people could have that happen to them, and they would be so pleased with themselves and with what they've written. That would have more poets.
Yeah, which would be a nice place to, nice thing to have happen. You've talked a lot in the workshop about how, when you were growing up, poetry rhymed. It wasn't a craft technique. It wasn't a tool. It was what defined poetry at the time.
Yes.
And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that change over the course of your lifetime, your relationship with it, because a lot of your poems in this collection, they do rhyme, and you're a skilled writer, so it works. But you started dabbling with non-rhyming poems. I remember the first time you brought a poem that didn't rhyme to the workshop, and you called me on it. You're like, "Hey, Jeremy, I brought one that doesn't rhyme." And so I'm curious about your thoughts about that, like over, your awareness of rhyming and your relationship with going off the deep end and trying something new.
Or going off the shallow end. I don't know. I'm only kidding. When I was a little girl, very little, from the time I could understand words, my grandmother lived with us, and she used to read nursery rhymes to me. And my mother also did. And when I started going to school, we read nursery rhymes in school, and everything always rhymed. So it just grew to be a part of me that poems rhyme. And I know that a lot of them don't anymore, but mine still do. Not all of them. Jeremy would say, are you ever going to write a poem that doesn't rhyme? Because sometimes people in the workshop will say, poems are not supposed to rhyme anymore. We're past that stage. And I would think to myself, well, maybe you are past that stage, but I'm still in it. And so people say to me, how can you think to make things like that rhyme? And I say to myself, I don't think about it. It's just the way it happens. Rhyme just comes out as part of the poem, and it's supposed to be there for me. Mm-hmm. But when you were saying a lot of people don't rhyme anymore, and they express the same thing without having it rhyme, and that's the way a lot of poets write. Most poets write today. So I tried it, and I've done it sometimes for you, and I really started doing it for you because I knew you wanted me to. And so I did, and I enjoy it. But when I'm just by myself, most of the time, I won't say I revert. I switch back to rhyming, because rhyming is what comes out. Yeah. It just comes natural to me to rhyme. When I was in college, there was a play and there was a movie titled David and Lisa. And the whole story and the whole movie was rhyming. It was a David and Lisa who would speak to each other only in rhyme. And they didn't try, it's just the way they talked. And it was a wonderful movie. And I saw that movie as long as I could while it was on campus. I saw it several times. And I just said, that's what I want to do. And so I would rhyme. Even when I was teaching school for 30 years, sometimes I would give lessons that rhymed. Or when I would give an English grammar test, one thing I did was I always would include, I had a lab class where I had the same students for 4 periods in the day. And I would give them a test, let's say a grammar test on adjectives or whatever, and I would include everybody's name in the class as part of the test. Everybody would be glad to take the test so they could see what I said about them. And I often made things in the test rhyme, just because that's what I do.
Yeah.
It's just who I am.
I do appreciate you trying. And like my goal in the workshop is always to not get people to do things that they're necessarily uncomfortable with, but to encourage them to grow by trying new things. And I
Right.
always appreciate that you always did. You always wanted to step into that place that you may not have felt comfortable and then see what you could make of it. And I think that's by shaking things up, that's how you become a better writer. That's personal belief. So that's my that's my way of saying thank you for doing that. Do you think it
It's
helped?
okay.
Do you think by shaking things up it made you a better writer?
Well, I think anything you do to increase what you're able to do makes you become better as you go along, at least. Maybe not initially, but you improve as you do more. And I do enjoy writing the things that don't rhyme. But when I just revert back to me, I rhyme naturally. I work at rhyming. I work at not rhyming, but I enjoy it when I'm finished and I think, wow, that was really cool. I didn't think I could do that. Or I would have probably made it rhyme, but I like it better this way.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yes, I've grown from doing that.
Does it feel like when you go back to rhyming, does it feel like you're back in the groove? Does it feel
No, it's not that I'm back in the groove because that would mean that the other wasn't in the groove.
that's
The
fair?
other is just a different way of writing. And I was, you know, thinking that I could expand what I could share with people if I knew how to do it more than one way. So that's why I've tried writing things that don't rhyme because I have to think about them a lot more and how to say what I want to say, whereas rhyming, it just comes naturally.
Okay. The last question I want to ask you about is I found out that which I think is it's just so sweet. You and Richard have amassed over the years a massive number of letters and postcards and just adorably sweet things that you guys have written one another. And some of those are poems. And I've always wanted to ask this, that expression with Richard, is it much different than writing a poem? Is it like even if it's not a poem, but even if it is there, are you in a different headspace when you do that? Is it something that the two of you started consciously doing? Was it just like someone wrote someone else a nice note and then you kept it and then it turned into a thing? Or, you know, what is that process for you?
When we first started dating, he lived on one side of town and I lived on the other side of town. And I had to go past his house to get from work to get home.
Mm.
And he wasn't there at that time because he still was working. And so sometimes I would just write a little note and put it in the mailbox, just a little short note. And then he started leaving a note for me in the mailbox occasionally. And that was the beginning of it. And then after a while, when we started dating, I wrote him a poem one day and it just grew and we started writing. He's always been very touching in that he always sends me cards, even for no reason. He'll go out and he wants to get me a card for something that happened in our life or whatever. And he would always start writing a note in it. And I do too. And we still do to this day. I have a huge collection of notes that we've written to each other in cards. In fact, I have the cards. I have boxes of them. and I've often thought someday I would like to have a book that has his notes to me and my notes to him, because maybe there are other couples who would like to do that and they don't know what to write or how to start. And maybe it would give them some ideas.
Yeah, It's so sweet. I just remember looking at them and like my heart melted. It was awesome. Would you mind reading another poem or two from the collection?
No, I wouldn't mind that at all. Let's see, what would you like me to read? Well, here's an unusual one. When I gave you my poems, you said that you wanted me to have the regular ones, I think was the word you used, and then you wanted me to include some on trees and some on odd things. And I said, oh, I've written a lot of odd poems. And so you had me include some, and I thought maybe he'll have one of these in here. Well, you have several of them in here. So this is another one. I wrote this, it's called Rims of City Curbing. And at one time in the summers between teaching, I worked downtown at a law firm. And one time I was just standing on the curb waiting to go across the street so I could get back from lunch. And I started thinking about what is the street thinking? And that's how I came up with Rims of City Curbing. Just as farms and fields call to ants, grasshoppers, and butterflies, come, creep, jump along lanes, flutter near my flowers, be part of me. So too, rims of city curbing scream softly, helplessly, hum, whir, buzz, beep. Your wheels on my unsmooth skin, many wheels and many rushing feet, allay my nighttime fear that you will not return to make me whole. Yes, come, be part of me, be me, be.
Wow, I really do like that poem.
Thank you.
That is one of my favorites of yours.
Thank you. I think I'm going to read the poem that I wrote for Richard for this chapbook. And we didn't know what to call the book. You and I talked about it, and you asked for a title, and I didn't know what to think about, but I said, I've always liked trees. Richard and I would go for rides. We still do go for rides a lot. And there are so many groups of trees or stands of trees that we see, and we always say one of us or the other. I wonder how many trees there are there. And one time I said, I wonder how many trees there are in the world. And then he'll go to Google and look it up and find out all these answers, but we're into trees a lot. This is called A Tree Called We. If you counted every forest, every branch on every tree, if you added up the numbers and presented them to me, if you grafted them together, made a tree that we call we, if every leaf was made from love, renewing every season, if every ring from every tree gave love another reason, if every cell in this tall tree showed love, the kind that he's in, you would have a fine example of what our love brings to these, growing deeper than the oceans and wider than the seas, growing higher than the mountains, feeling softer than a breeze, holding on to every tenderness, forgiving through each storm, walking through a time of coldness on a path to where it's warm, keeping love and joy and peace alive in every day we share, having patience filled with kindness to scatter everywhere, using goodness, faith, and gentleness, and having self-control, and treasuring the tree called we, each leaf, each branch, the whole.
Beautiful. That is excellent. And if you would like more of these, I encourage you to check out Lorene's book, A Tree Called We. You can find the catalog for RMP at flamingowriters.weebly.com/micropress. You can also go to our Facebook with the Flamingo Writers Guild Facebook page. Lorene, thank you again. This is a wonderful book. I'm honored that we were able to publish this collection.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm honored that you decided to let me.